Alright, guys, part 4, and now we're going to do a specific narrative of a genocide that took place within the context of gendercide. And I'm starting out with the extermination of the Joyas. You know, I did actually look for other ones, but this seems like a specific PDF from a book, so that's interesting. Anyways, yes, I believe this is Extermination of Third Gendered Individuals. Alright. Deborah A. Miranda. Uh, Attempting to address the many communities from which she spoke, Paula Gunn Allen once asserted, quote, "I cannot do one identity. I'm simply not capable of it, and it took me years to understand that that's one of the features of my upbringing. I was raised in a mixed cultural group, mixed linguistic, mixed religion, mixed race. Laguna itself is that way. So I get really uncomfortable in any kind of monocultural group. Although Allen does not speak specifically of another community, her lesbian family. In this quotation, her legacy of activism and the uns- writing document the unspoken inclusion of sexual orientation within her list of identities. Like Allen, my own identity is not monocultural. By blood, I am Esalen and Chumash, California native, as well as Jewish. Hold on. Man, that just really distracted me. French and English. I was born at ACLU Medical Center, raised in trailer park and rural landscapes. Possess a PhD and teach at a small private Southern liberal arts university. I am fluent in English, can read Spanish, and was called to an aliyah at the mitzvah, at the bat mitzvah of my partner's niece. Who am I? Where is my home? In my poetry and my scholarship, I work through issues of complex identities for which of my life, primarily those relating to my position as a mixed blood woman with an Indian father and European American mother, but one of the most urgent questions in my life, the intersection of being Indian and being lesbian, has always been more complicated, less easily articulated than anything else. Here again, Ellen's body of work has been more helpful. In a poem titled, quote, "Some Like Indians Endure." Oh, hold on. Allen plays with concepts of just what makes an Indian, and asks if those qualities, whatever they are necessarily exclusive to Indians. At least the heart of this poem is this thought, quote, "I have it in my mind that dykes are Indians. They're a lot like Indians." Uh, okay. I guess I can say that since, yeah, it's just some gay slur. Alright. They are massacred. Oh, hold on. I gotta. Oh, wait, this is a different one? Okay, I thought that was a continuation of the same one. Okay. GLQ, A Journey of Lesbian and Gay Studies. Oh, they were massacred. Lots of times. They always came back. Like the gas, like the clouds, they got massacred again. This poem illustrates the multiple directions of Allen's thought, while defending the concepts of Indian as something different and distinguishable from colonizing cultures around it. Allen simultaneously compares the qualities of being Indian with those of being lesbian. She comes up with lists of similarities for both identities, the lengthiness of which overwhelms her ability to keep the two apart. While Allen recognizes balance and wholeness in both her Laguna and lesbian identities, this is not necessarily something that completely expresses my own situation. While I while researching material for my book, quote, Bad Indians, a Tribal Memoir, end quote. However, I came across a page of the ethnologist J.P. Harrington's field notes that provided a doorway for me to enter into a conversation about complex identities with my ancestors. Tracing my California native ancestors from first contact with Spanish missionaries through contemporary times, my research required that I immerse myself in a rich variety of archival resources, correspondence between missionaries and their supervisors in Spain, research records of baptism, birth, and death, as well as finances and legal causes, the as told to testimonies of missionized Indians both during or before, during, and after the mission era, as well as newspapers, family, and oral history, photographs, and ethnological and anthropological data from earliest contacts through the salvage ethnology end quote, era and into the present. None of these archival materials from unfiltered Indian voices, such records would be impossible both because of their colonizing context and the prevalence of among oral tradition among California Indians that did not leave contextual traces. The difficulties of using non Indian archives to tell an Indian story are epic. Biases, agendas, cultural pride, notions of manifest destiny, and the desire to own history mean that one can never simply read and accept even the most basic non native detail without multiple investigations into what collected the information, what their motivations were, who preserved the information, and their motivations. The use of rhetorical devices like the passive voice so prevalent in missionization histories. Quote, the missions were built using adobe bricks, end quote, rather than, quote, Indians often held captive and or punished by flogging built the missions without compensation, end quote. Learning how to reread the archive through eyes of a mixed-blood California Indian lesbian poet and scholar was an education in of itself. So the fact that this essay emerges from one short handwritten piece of information gleaned by Harrington from one of my ancestors about the oldest ancestor should not be surprising. To tell the story of this field note, which I obviously can't read, I don't even know if that's cursive. Jesus. Anyways, to tell the story of this field note, for which I used the shorthand title Jodos, Spanish slang for queer or faggot, I must pull threads of several stories together. The field note is like a petroglyph. When I touch it, so much else must be known, communicated, and understood to see the power within what looks like a simple inscription. Hold on. Sorry, cars keep going by. I ran a bit of Carmel Mission Indian trivia. Once read, this note opens out into deeper and deeper stories. Some of those stories are full of grief, like the one that follows, yet they are all essential to possessing this. So I'm gonna, if anyone can read that, they can just pause it, I guess, right? This archival evidence and giving it a truly indigenous reading. When I say indigenous reading, I mean a reading that enriches Native lives with meaning, survival, and love, which points to the important role of archival reconstruction in developing a robust two-spirit tradition today. In the last 2 decades, the archaeology of sexuality and gender has also helped create new ways to use these biases, primarily resources, and I hope to pull together the many shards of information available in order to glimpse what contemporary California Indians might use in our efforts to reclaim and reinvent ourselves. This essay then examines methods of employed by the Spaniards to exterminate the Joya. The Spanish, some for third gender people, asks what that extermination meant to California Indian cultures, explores the survival of this third gender as first Joyas, then Jodos, Spanish for homosexual or faggot, and evaluates the emergence of spiritual and physical renewal of the ancestral third gender in California in California Indian Two-Spirit individuals. It is both a personal story and a historical struggle about identity played out in many indigenous communities all over the world. Waging Genocide 101. Spanish colonizers, from royalty to soldiers to padre, believed that American Indians were intellectually, physiologically, and spiritually immature, if not actual animals. In the era eventually known as California, the genocidal policy of the Spanish crown would lead to a severe population crash. Numbering 1 million at first contact, California Indians plummeted to about 10,000 survivors in just over 100 years. Part of this mission, Part of this massive loss were third gender people who were lost not by passive colonizing collateral damage, but as disease or starvation, but through active, conscious, violent extermination. Speaking of the Chumash people living along the southern coast, my grandmother's tribal roots, Pedro Fages, a Spanish soldier, makes clear that soldiers and priests colonizing Mexico and what would become California arrived with deep abhorrence of what they viewed as homosexual relationships. In this soldier's memoir, written in 1775, Fages reports, quote, I have substantial evidence that those Indian men who, both here and farther inland, are observed in the dress, clothing, and character of women, there being 2 or 3 such in each village, pass as sodomites by profession, it being confirmed that all those Indians are much addicted to this abominable vice, and and permit the heathen to practice the execrable, unnatural abuse of their bodies. They are called Joyas, and are held in great esteem. Let this mention suffice for a matter which could not be omitted, an account of the bearing it may have on the discussion of the reduction of these natives, with the promise to revert in another place to an excess too criminal that it seems even forbidden to speak its name. But we place our trust in God and expect that these accursed people will disappear with the growth of the missions. Abominable vice will be eliminated to the extent that the Catholic faith and all other virtues are firmly implanted here, for the glory of God and the benefit of those poor ignorance. End quote. Much of what little we know about the Joyas, Spanish for jewels, as I discuss below, is limited to observations like that of Fagus, choked by Eurocentric values and mores. The majority of Spanish soldiers and priests were not interested in learning about Californian Indian culture, and recorded only as much as was needed to dictate spiritual and corporeal discipline and or punishment. There are no known recorded interviews with a Joya by either priest or Spaniard, let alone the salvage ethnologist who arrived 100 years later. Uh, In this section, I provide an overview of what first contact between Joya and Spaniard looks like, and how that encounter leaves scars to this day in California Indian culture. The key word here is not, in fact, encounter, but destruction. Weapons of mass destruction, the mastiffs. As I show, while the Spanish priests' disciplinary methods might be strict and intolerant, they were at least attempting to deal with Joyas and Joya relationships in the ways that allowed these Indians to live, albeit marginalized and shamed. Spanish soldiers, with a different, less patient method, uh, threw they threw the Joyas to their dogs, shouting the command, "Tamalos!" Take them or sick 'em. The Spanish soldiers ordered execution of Joyas to be specially bred mastiffs and greyhounds, the dogs of the conquest, who had already acquired a taste for human flesh and were frequently fed live Indians when other food was unavailable, were the colonizers' weapon of mass destruction. In this history of the relationship between the dogs and men, Stanley Coren explains just how efficiently these weapons were. The mastiffs of that era could weigh 250 pounds and stand nearly 3 feet at the soldier. What? Wow. Their massive jaws could crush bones even through leather armor. The greyhounds of that period, meanwhile, could be over 100 pounds and 30 inches at the shoulder. These lighter dogs could outrun any man. Well, you would have to really. Yeah, okay, whatever. I feel like that's most dogs could be potentially faster to an untrained human, and their slashing attack could easily disembowel a person in a matter of seconds. Columbus brought dogs along with them on his second journey and claimed that one dog was worth 50 soldiers in subduing the natives. On September 23rd, 1513, the explorer Vasco Nunez de Balbo came on about 40 indigenous men, all dressed as women, engaged in what he called preposterous Venus. He commanded his men to give the men as a prey to his doggos, or doges, end quote, and the men were torn apart alive. Corin states matter-of-factly that, quote, these dogs were considered to be mere weapons and sometimes instruments of torture, end quote. By the time the Spaniards had expanded their territory to California, the use of the dogs as weapons to kill or eat Indians, particularly Joyas, was well established. Was this violence against Joyas classic homophobia, fear of people with the same sex orientation, or genocide? It's en masse, so, and it's a group that you're specifically doing this because of what they are, so yeah, it's genocide. Uh, oh, sorry. Wow. I argue that genocide is the correct term, as Mirren S. Albert comments. Genocide would then be an attack on a group of victims based on the victim's gender/sex, such as an attack would only really occur if men or women are victimized because of their primary identity as men or women. In the case of male gendercide, male victims would be victims first and foremost because they are men, not male Bosnians, Jews, or Tutsis. Moreover, it must be the perpetrators themselves, not outside observers, making ex post analysis who identify a specific gender/sex as a threat and therefore a target for extermination. As such, we must be able to explicitly show that the perpetrators target a gender victim group based on the victim's primary identity as either man or woman. Or I must add, as a third gender? Increasingly, although Herbert doesn't consider that possibility, her argument supports my own definition of gendercide as an act of violence committed against the victim's primary gender identity. Consider the immediate effect of Balbo's punishment of the Sodomites when local Indians found out about the executions, quote, upon the filthy kind of men, end quote. The Indians turned to the Spaniards, quote, as if it had been to Hercules for refuge, end quote, and quickly rounded up all the other third gender people in the area, quote, spitting in their faces and crying out to our men to take revenge of them and rid them of the world from among men as contagious beasts, end quote. This is not homophobia, widely defined as irrational fear or aversion to homosexuals, with some secret discrimination against homosexuals. Obviously, the Indians were not suddenly surprised to find Joyas in their midst. And dragging people to certain death went far beyond discrimination or culturally condemned chastisement. This was fear of death, more specifically of being murdered. What the local indigenous peoples had been taught was gendercide, the killing of a particular gender because of their gender. As Herbert says in her description of gendercide above, it must be the perpetrators themselves, not outside observers making expose analysis, who identify a specific gender/sex as a threat and therefore target for extermination, end quote. Now that the Spaniards had made it clear that to tolerate, harbor, or associate with the third gender meant death, and that nothing could stand against their dogs of war. The indigenous community knew that demonstrations of acquiescence to this force was essential for the survival of the remaining community. And both the community and the Spaniards knew exactly which people were marked for execution. This tragic pattern in which one segment of indigenous population was sacrificed in hopes that others would survive, continues to fester in many contemporary Native communities where people with same-sex orientation are no longer part of the cultural legacy, but feared, discriminated against, and locked out of tribal and familial homes. We have mistakenly called this behavior, quote, homophobia in Indian country. To call it gendercide would certainly require rethinking the assimilation of Euro-American cultural values and the meaning of indigenous community. Thus, the killing of the Joyas by Spaniards was, indeed, quote, part of the coordinated plan of destruction, end quote, but it was only one strategy of gendercide. Renaming. Father Juan Crespi, part of the 1769 Sacred Expedition from Mexico to Atla, California, traveled with an exploration party through numerous Chumash coastal villages. Quote, "We have seen heathen men wearing the dress of women," he wrote. "We have not been able to understand what it means, not what its purpose is. Um, Time and an understanding of the language, when it is learned, will make it clear," end quote. Crespi's willingness to wait for, quote, an understanding of the language, end quote, was not, unfortunately, a common sentiment among his countrymen. And although yeah, obviously not. Who the hell just waits for evidence? I'm sorry, that's not funny. It's just, that's so true. I'm sorry, guys. That was just, alright. Um, alright. And although he describes, but does not attempt to name these, quote, men wearing the dress of women, it wasn't long before someone else did. Erasure of tribal terms, tribal group names, and personal tribal names during colonization was a strategy used by European colonizers throughout the Americas. The act of naming was, and still is, a deeply respected and important aspect of indigenous culture. Although naming ceremonies among North American Indians followed many traditions, varying according to tribe and often even by band or time period, what has never changed is an acknowledgement of the sense of power inherent in the name or in the person performing the act of naming and the consequent right to produce self-names as utterances of empowerment. Renaming both human beings and their own name for people or objects in their world is a political act of dominance. As Stephen Greenblatt writes of Christopher Columbus' initial acts of renaming lands whose indigenous names the inhabitants had already shared with him, quote, "The founding action of Christian imperialism is a christening. Such a christening entails the cancellation of the native name, uh, the erasure of the aliens on exorcism, an appropriation, and a gift. It is the taking of possession, conferral of identity," end quote. To replace various tribal words for a Spanish word is indeed an appropriation of sovereignty, a gift that cannot be refused, and perhaps more properly called an imposition. Wow. Therefore, when Spaniards arrived in Alta California and encountered a class of Indians we would not now identify as being third gender, it makes sense that in exercising power over the land and inhabitants, one of the first things that Spaniards did was invent a name for the third gender phenomenon, a name applied only to California Indians identified by Spaniards as men who dressed as women and had sex with other men. Interestingly, although Spanish morality disapproved of sodomy within their own culture and had a collection of words and euphemisms available to describe el acto passido nefando, the silent unspoken sin, and its participants hermaphrodita, sodomita, uh, yeah, they did not choose to apply these existing Spanish labels to California Indians. Instead, overwhelmingly, primary sources used the word Joya. As early as 1775, only 6 years after the Crespi made his observation, the term Joya was already in widespread use. In describing the customs of Indian women in 1775, Fagus writes, quote, The Indian woman takes the little girl with her, and they may learn to gather seeds and may accustom themselves to carrying the basket. In this routine, in this routine are generally included some of the worthless creatures with which they call Joyas. End quote. Although Faggus states that, quote, they, Indians, are the word Joyas, the slippage is obviously when he wrote that in 1976 or 77, the missionaries at Mission San Antonio also reported that, quote, the priests were advised that two pagans had gone into one of the houses of the neophytes, one in his natural raiment and other dressed as a woman. Such a person the Indians in their native language called a Joya. Immediately the missionary with the corporal and soldier went to the house to see what they were looking for, and what they found the two in an unspeakable sinful act. They punished them, although not so much as deserved. The priest tried to present to them the enormity of their deed. The pagan replied that the Joya was his wife. Along the Chenal County or Santa Barbara, many Joyas are found. Okay, that's weird. In pre-contact California, the linguist Leanne Hinton writes, quote, over the 100 languages were spoken here, representing five or more major language families and various smaller families and linguistic isolates, end quote. Adding in estimates of hundreds of different dialects, it seems clear that every California tribe would have its own word for third gender people, not the generic Joya that Spaniards records give us. For example, at Mission San Diego, Father Boscana describes the biological men who dressed and lived as women, or, as he put it, those who are accustomed to marrying males with males. He writes, quote, whilst yet in infancy, they were selected and instructed as they increased in years in all of the duties of the woman, in their mode of dress, of walking and dancing, so that in almost every particular they reassemble females. To distinguish this detested race at this mission, they were called Kuit in the mountains, Oloqui, and in other parts they were known by the name of Koyas. End quote. Joyas, then, is a complete new term and must have been fashioned one way or another by the Spaniards, perhaps from an indigenous word that sounded like joyas, or as commentary on the Joyas' fondness for women's clothing, jewelry, and hairstyles. Spanish explorers in Mexico called hummingbirds joyas voladores or flying jewels. End quote. It seems doubtful that the Spaniards would retain a beautiful name like jewel to describe what they saw as the lowest, most bestial segment of the Indian community, unless it was meant as a kind of sarcasm to enact a sense of power and superiority over the third gendered people. James Sandoz has some sense of this as well, writing that the Spanish called them jewels, a term that may have been derisive in Spanish culture, but inadvertently conveyed the regard with which such men were held in Chumash culture, end quote. By derisive, Sandoz perhaps means that the Spaniards were making fun of what they perceived to be of ridiculous and shameful status. Another possibility for the origins of Joyas lies in a linguistic feat, the pun. For years, people have assumed that the California town Jola, the double L in Spanish is pronounced as a Y, is simply a misspelling of Joya. However, Nelly Van de Grift Sanchez writes, quote, La Jala, a word of doubtful origin, said by some persons to mean a pool, by others to be from Hoya, a hollow sounded by hills, and by still others to be a possible corruption of Joya or Jewel. goddamn. This is some interesting etymology stuff. The suggestion the suggestion has been made that La Jolla was named from caves situated which contain pools. Yet another similar sounding Spanish word is olla, which means jar or vessel. All of these things have in common a pool, a hollow, a vessel is that each is a kind of container, a receptacle. Ethnologists and Spaniards alike agree that the Joya's role as a biological male living as a female meant many other things. Joyas were sexually active with normative men as the recipients of anal sex. In fact, a Joya would never consider having sex with another Joya. This was not forbidden, simply unthinkable. So this may truly have been a curse of, quote, I'm not Joya, but my boyfriend is. Okay. All in all, the renaming of the Joya was not likely meant to be a compliment, but strangely enough, it does reflect the respect with which pre-contact California natives regarded this gender. Perhaps, as with the word Indian, Joya has strong potential for reappropriation and a new signification of value. By choosing this word and not one of their established homolexioms, this act of renaming reinforcing the notion that Spaniard priests and soldiers sensed something else, an undefinable gender role, a new class of people going on here, something more different than the deviant sodomites of their own culture. On an individual basis, the changing of California Indian personal names is recorded in the mission uh, baptism records. An Indian from Cajats was baptized in Mission Santa Barbara in 1819, stripped of the name Liaxacat and renamed Vitor Maria. Jutaya from Chucom near Mission San Jose became Robustiano in 1823. In 1832, an Indian from Liato near San Francisco Mission came in with the same Katsesi but was baptized Viador. These names, three people brought into mission from baptism at ages 32, 33, and 45, respectively, had notorious had notation uh, had notations on their baptism records of another kind of naming. Armafrodito o Joya or Joya o Amagarado. The padres applied Spanish words meaning hermaphrodite or effeminate, as well as, in three cases, Joya. Vitor Maria died in 1821, just 2 years after baptism. Robustiano died in 1832, 9 years after baptism. There is no death record for Viador, who may have been one of the many mission runaways. Interestingly, Joya or other gender identifiers do not appear on the death records available, unlike the baptisms. Had Vitor and Robustiano learned to hide their gender, or was it simply accepted and no longer noted? It seems most likely that in the interest of survival, coming into the mission as grown adults in this later era usually meant starvation and or capture. A Joya would at least attempt a form of assimilation such as assuming a male dress and work roles. However, as Sandoz comments, quote, if contemporary study is any guide, these Barbache, especially when they entered the missions, were important links between the new European exposed culture and traditional Chumish ways. End quote. The entrance of older Joyas raised to revere and present cultural and spiritual continuity into California missions, where native culture was disparaged and forbidden, must have provided a powerful infusion of native language, religion, and values that contributed or delayed assimilation. Indeed, on a larger scale, Tremendously high death rates combined with perilously low birth rates meant a constant restocking of the mission with wild Indians captured from further and farther away as times went on, creating a situation where the Spanish language and European farming slash herding skills were not passed from one generation to the next, but had to be retaught to each incoming wave. This breakdown in transference of culture actually allowed California natives a chance to retain more indigenous culture, albeit at greater personal loss. Okay. Alright, I am gonna move on to the next part. Well, I'm gonna read more of this afterwards. I'll be back, guys.